Welcome to Dialogue Doodles. I'm your host, Jack. Today we're diving into one of the most fascinating stories in art history. How a boy born with nearly every disadvantage went on to become perhaps the greatest genius humanity has ever known. Joining me today is Renaissance art historian Henry Mitchell. Henry, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jack. And you've already touched on what makes Leonardo's story so compelling. It's really about how limitations can sometimes become the foundation for extraordinary achievements.
You know, Henry, it's almost like a modern startup story, someone working from their garage to build something revolutionary. Except in this case, we're talking about 15th century Italy.
That's actually a great analogy, Jack. Like many of today's innovators, Leonardo started from a position that most people would consider a serious disadvantage.
Let's start at the beginning. April 1452, in a small Tuscan town. What made Leonardo's birth so significant?
Well, Leonardo was born at the third hour of the night in Vinci, but what's crucial here is his status. He was illegitimate, born to a notary named Ser Piero and a peasant woman, Caterina.
And in 15th century Italy, being illegitimate wasn't just a social stigma, right?
Exactly. It had very practical implications. Leonardo couldn't attend Latin schools, couldn't become a notary like his father, couldn't join many guilds. Essentially, many traditional paths to success were closed to him from birth.
Yet somehow, these limitations seemed to push him in a different direction.
That's one of the most fascinating aspects. Because he couldn't receive a classical education, Leonardo became an intensely observant self-learner. He developed this remarkable ability to understand things through direct observation and experience.
It's almost like being forced off the conventional path led him to develop his own unique way of learning.
Precisely. And this would become his greatest strength, this ability to see the world directly, without the filter of classical authorities that dominated education at the time.
This brings us to a crucial turning point in his story, his apprenticeship with Andrea del Verrocchio. How did that come about?
Well, by age 14, Leonardo's father had recognized his son's extraordinary talent for drawing and arranged for him to enter Verrocchio's workshop, one of the most prestigious in Florence at the time.
For our listeners who might not be familiar, could you explain what it meant to be an apprentice in a Renaissance workshop?
Think of it as a combination of art school, technical training, and business education all rolled into one. Apprentices didn't just learn to paint, they learned everything from grinding pigments to managing commissions. It was a complete immersion in the craft.
And Verrocchio's workshop was special, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Verrocchio wasn't just a painter, he was a sculptor, goldsmith, and engineer. This multidisciplinary environment perfectly suited Leonardo's wide-ranging curiosity.
It sounds like despite his earlier limitations, Leonardo had landed in exactly the right place.
Yes, and this is where we see something remarkable happen. While most apprentices simply followed their master's style, Leonardo began developing his own innovative techniques. He started experimenting with oil paints when most Italian artists were still using egg tempera.
What made oil painting so revolutionary?
Oil paints allowed for much more subtle gradations of color and tone. They dry more slowly, so artists could blend colors directly on the canvas. Leonardo used this to develop his famous sfumato technique, those incredibly soft, smoky transitions between light and shadow.
And this all culminated in a particular painting, didn't it? The Baptism of Christ?
Yes, this is one of the most fascinating moments in art history. The painting was primarily Verrocchio's work, but Leonardo was asked to paint one of the angels. The difference between Leonardo's angel and the rest of the painting is striking.
How so?
Leonardo's angel has this incredible softness, this almost ethereal quality that makes Verrocchio's figures look almost rigid in comparison. There's actually a story that when Verrocchio saw Leonardo's work, he was so impressed, or perhaps dismayed, that he vowed never to paint again.
Do we think that story is true?
Probably not literally true, but it captures something important. This was the moment when everyone realized that Leonardo wasn't just talented, he was revolutionary. He wasn't just learning the craft, he was reinventing it.
It's remarkable to think that someone who couldn't even get a formal education was now pushing the boundaries of what was possible in art.
And you know, Jack, what's particularly fascinating is how Leonardo's early experiences shaped his entire approach to learning and creation.
How so? What was different about his approach?
Well, because he never had that formal classical education, he developed this incredible reliance on direct observation. He would spend hours studying how light fell on faces, how muscles moved under skin, how birds' wings worked during flight.
So in a way, being blocked from traditional education forced him to develop his own methodology.
Exactly. While other artists were primarily studying classical texts and copying old masters, Leonardo was out there doing what we'd now call empirical research. He was essentially inventing his own form of scientific method.
This reminds me of something you mentioned earlier about his notebooks. Did this start during his time with Verrocchio?
Yes, this is when he began his famous practice of keeping detailed notebooks. Since he couldn't rely on formal texts, he created his own, filling thousands of pages with observations, questions, and detailed drawings.
And these weren't just art notes, were they?
Not at all. They covered everything: anatomy, engineering, botany, mathematics. He was breaking down the traditional barriers between art and science. In fact, for Leonardo, there was no distinction. It was all part of understanding how the world worked.
It's almost like his early limitations created this freedom from conventional thinking.
That's brilliantly put. His illegitimacy, which initially seemed like a curse, actually freed him from the intellectual constraints of his time. He wasn't bound by traditional academic approaches or conventional wisdom.
You know, Henry, this makes me think about modern education. Do we sometimes undervalue this kind of direct observational learning?
It's a provocative question. Leonardo's example shows us that real innovation often comes from questioning established methods and trusting our own observations. He was essentially self-taught, but his understanding of many subjects went far beyond what was being taught in the universities of his time.
Did his early experiences in Verrocchio's workshop influence how he later ran his own studio?
Absolutely. Leonardo created what we might today call an interdisciplinary learning environment. His workshop wasn't just about painting, it was a place where art, science, and engineering all came together.
So he basically took what worked from his apprenticeship but then revolutionized the rest.
Precisely. He maintained the practical, hands-on aspects of traditional workshop training but added this layer of systematic observation and experimentation that was completely new.
You know, Henry, as we wrap up our discussion about Leonardo's early years, I keep coming back to this idea of turning limitations into advantages. It seems almost paradoxical.
It really is remarkable. And what's particularly fascinating is that the very things that might have held him back, his illegitimacy, his lack of classical education, ended up contributing to what made him unique.
Could you elaborate on that? What's the key lesson here?
Well, I think the key lesson is that Leonardo didn't just overcome his limitations, he transformed them. Being outside the traditional educational system meant he had to develop his own ways of learning and understanding. This led to his extraordinary observational skills and his ability to connect ideas across different fields.
It's almost like he created his own renaissance while living through the Renaissance.
That's a wonderful way to put it. And you know, this early period we've discussed today, from his birth to his time in Verrocchio's workshop, really set the pattern for his entire life. He never stopped being that curious observer who questioned everything and looked for connections others missed.
And I suppose that's why we're still fascinated by him today.
Exactly. Leonardo shows us that true innovation often comes from thinking outside established systems. His story reminds us that what matters isn't so much the opportunities you're given, but what you do with the opportunities you have.
Before we wrap up, what would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from Leonardo's early years?
I'd say it's that limitations don't have to define us. Leonardo's greatest strength was his ability to look at the world with fresh eyes, unencumbered by conventional wisdom. That's something we can all learn from, regardless of our circumstances.
Thank you, Henry. This has been a fascinating exploration of how Leonardo's early years shaped one of history's most remarkable minds.
Thank you, Jack. It's been a pleasure discussing this extraordinary figure who reminds us that genius often emerges from the most unexpected circumstances.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey through Leonardo's formative years. Until next time, keep questioning, keep observing, and remember, sometimes your greatest limitations can become your greatest strengths.